Welcome to this discussion of the Forum for World Education. I'm Eric Hanashek. I'm a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University. Well, we all know that this is a strange time for schools, where schools at all levels are being quite disrupted. Today, we're going to explore a little bit about higher education, which has some special aspects. In the United States, in particular, the involvement of foreign students makes higher education different than K-12 education. And for this discussion, we have the privilege of talking about these issues with Secretary Condoleezza Rice. She is really uniquely suited to discuss this in the role of foreign students at U.S. universities and how that interacts with COVID-19. Secretary Rice has a PhD in political science and has spent her career moving in between government service and teaching in the universities. In terms of government service, she has been National Security Advisor to President George W. Bush and then became the Secretary of State. At the university, she's taught at the School of Humanities and Arts and the Business School at Stanford University, and she's been the provost at the university. Condi, thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you, Rick.
Let me just start right in, because in the United States, foreign students have been attending U.S. universities in larger and larger numbers. Could you give us your views on how foreign students at Stanford and elsewhere fit in? How does it go with international cooperation and other things?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on, and I look forward to our conversation about education. And let me start with the question that you asked about foreign students. I am a big advocate of the exchange of students between countries. I believe it's important that foreign students come to the United States. I think it's important that American students go to foreign countries. Not only is there no other experience like studying in a country that is not your own, but it is also just a life-changing experience. It's not just the education that you receive, but it's the opportunity to be in another place, to understand another culture, to have to live in that culture. I spent 5 pretty lonely months in the Soviet Union back at the end of the 1970s studying Russian language. It was transforming for my life. And so I'm a major proponent of foreign students in our schools and in our countries. I think it makes them better for their lives, and it makes our students better to have been in the company of studying with, befriending, getting to know over a lifetime people who come from different perspectives and different cultures.
So if I looked at this from the U.S. standpoint, does it help scientific activities, the economy? Do you have any views on that?
I really do believe that, particularly if you think about economic development or scientific progress, really we should think of the scientific side of this as borderless. One of the things that I remember when I was provost, that when I would read the folders of people we were about to appoint to the faculty, and I would read the biographies and I would read the vitae, it was very often the case that there were citations in articles from across the world, because scientists understood that scientific progress and scientific knowledge ought to be holistic for everything that's known in the world, that human knowledge ought to have no boundaries. I really strongly believe that, and I think we're much better off when we, as the U.S., can take advantage of the whole range of human knowledge that's out there. We don't own human knowledge here in the United States, and we don't have a special place in being the only ones to innovate and to come up with knowledge. And so I'm a great believer in having knowledge cross boundaries, and one of the best ways to do that is through people. And so students who study in the United States, maybe as undergraduates or certainly as graduate students, are going to become a part of a worldwide bank of knowledge, and that's really very important.
So Condi, this is a strange time for universities or all schools, and we'll come back to primary and secondary later, but for universities, we're right in the middle of trying to figure out how to deal with COVID-19. Do you have some views on where universities should be going in the short run and what's going to happen in the longer run, which I think is the bigger issue?
Well, in the short run, we're going to have to be very careful and very much driven by what we think the health of the student body can do. And we have to remember that these are young people, but unfortunately, they're going to be in the company of people like us, Rick, who are on the other side of the bell curve. And so I understand the struggles that universities are having in deciding how to get cohorts back in a way that's safe, how to maintain distancing. Stanford, for instance, is a highly residential university. So how do you deal with having people live together and not spread the disease? I understand that these are very difficult problems, but I really do hope that we're going to be able to have a hybrid model at least. I think there are lots of classes that can be taught online. I'm actually a proponent of more of a hybrid model as we go forward, because there's some courses, large courses in the sciences, large courses, introductory courses, that I think actually can be taught just as well online, where pace of learning can be more personalized for students, and so I think those are good things. But there's no substitute for the seminar where people are in proximity of one another. They get to see each other's expressions. They get to work with each other. There's no substitute for the lab experience of a student in a laboratory. So when people talk about going online permanently, I hope we have in mind that we're going online for some activities and not for others. The other point that I would make is it's especially hard right now to deal with foreign students because we have travel restrictions, and it's of course a patchwork of travel restrictions. You can go from this country to that country, but not that country to the next country. And I really feel for our students who are trying to get back to places that they're going to study. I'm relieved that yesterday, actually, the administration rescinded what would have been a very harmful practice of saying that if you're studying online, you have to leave the country. That would have been total chaos logistically. And so I'm glad that we're not going to be dealing with that. But I would say this to professors, to administrators, and also to foreign students. Let's do everything we can to get our foreign students to the country so that they can study here. Let's do everything we can to keep them in the country so that they can study here. And let's be very aggressive with governments and with the enforcement authorities to say, this is also essential, that our foreign students are able to study in the places that they've been admitted.
So I thought that the big problem with universities is that they're designed to minimize social distance rather than maximize social distance.
They are.
And the question is, in your view of the world, where we go to more online and so forth, will we be changing that model?
I do think we are going to be changing the model because we're not going to have a choice but to change the model. We've already changed the model. As I suggested, it's a question of what do we change about the model. So if it's changing the model of the 700-person class, who are we kidding? We know that students stream those in their dorm rooms anyway, so maybe we're not losing much there. But if we're changing the model of the interaction of a faculty member with a student or a few students, there's a much higher cost to that. And so I hope we can be creative, whether it's more outdoor experiences in classes in places where we're lucky enough to have weather that permits that, whether faculty are going to have to take responsibility for perhaps meeting smaller numbers of students than we would normally. Maybe it's not the 25-person seminar. Maybe, faculty, you're going to have to think about 2 13-person seminars in order to make it possible to have those interactions.
So maybe we could switch now to a little bit to talk about primary and secondary education. There's a set of different issues there, and we've already seen, for example, in California, that the Los Angeles school system and the San Diego school system said that they're not going to have any in-person classes at all in the fall term. How do you think that we should be dealing with COVID-19? Do you have any ideas on how primary and secondary schools should be doing?
Yes. Well, I'm not a healthcare expert, and so, not an epidemiologist, so I can't speak to the data. I've seen data that suggests that children are not particularly susceptible, and some data from abroad that they don't particularly become very super spreaders of the virus. But those are really assessments that I have to leave to people who know the epidemiology. I will say this, one thing that we do know is that the less privileged you are, the more the school is actually a center of stability in your life. So kids who come from well-off communities, there's some, undoubtedly some learning deficit, undoubtedly some socialization deficit for those kids. But the kid I really worry about is the kid who comes from a difficult home where school is actually a respite, where the teacher is almost surrogate parent. Leave alone things like being able to get a good meal at the school, or being able to be in a place where people will report abuse, which, by the way, is not just a problem for underserved populations. I use the following vignette to describe this. I was actually homeschooled in first grade. The state of Alabama, in its wisdom, decided that unless you turned 6 by October 31st, you couldn't go to school to the next year. I was born November 14th. My parents were educators. There was no way I was going to miss a year in school. So my mother, who was a teacher, took a year's leave of absence, and she homeschooled me. By the time she finished with me, I was like third grade prepared because she was a teacher. She knew how to do that. But now let's think about the kid whose parents perhaps don't even speak English. How's that experience in homeschooling? And so I really do hope if these districts are going to say, well, these kids can't come back to school for X, Y, or Z reason, that they're also going to say, okay, so here's the support structure we're going to wrap around, particularly the most underserved kids, whether it is tutoring for them, whether it is a way for these kids to have social activities that remain, because we are seeing right now that COVID-19 is actually exacerbating longstanding underlying inequalities. And frankly, I haven't heard from all of those unions in Southern California that's saying, we have to protect the kids, we have to protect the teachers. I haven't heard a plan for how we're going to protect the kids from the other malignancies that are growing as a result of being out of school. And so that's a conversation that needs to take place.
So I completely agree with you, because all of the discussions that I see are basically about logistics. Right. How do we get people into classrooms? How do we space the desks? How do we make sure everybody has an iPad? And they haven't addressed the issues of learning losses, right, which are already significant and look like they'll continue growing with these current things.
And you can bet, Rick, they're going to grow exponentially with kids who are underserved, because the kids of well-to-do parents, they're going to find ways to backfill for the schools. I was talking to a friend of mine who has children who are kind of middle school age and a little older, and this person said, "Oh, I found all these games we can play on the computer together that teach them about this and teach them about that." So once again, the well-off parent is going to find a way to supplement educational opportunity. It's going to be the underserved kid who's totally dependent on the school who's going to be left behind.
I completely agree. And I think one of the concerns is that we're going to actually lose track of where these kids are. There's a lot of movement to, I think, misplaced uh, take the advantage of the COVID-19 to end all testing, all accountability, and so forth in the schools.
Yes, and that is a terrible idea. You know, we can say we understand why test scores were down during this period of whatever, but if we lose the sense that we have to keep testing and have to keep assessing, then we're going to have no baseline in a very short period of time. Because one problem in the schools is generations pass pretty quickly. And so we're going to have to worry about that. The other piece that I worry about is actually a social issue. When I've been very involved with Boys and Girls Clubs and doing after school and summer programs. We have them in 4 cities. They're called Center for a New Generation. And they're basically for strivers. They're not for the talented 10th. They're for kids who really just want to get better. And they're overwhelmingly underserved populations. We used to lose a few kids every year, and sometimes not a few, you know, half a dozen or more, who parents would move because of unemployment issues. When we had kids who were undocumented, they'd go back across the border and never come back. And so the school and these programs were a way of keeping account of these kids and making sure that they, in a sense, had a place to report into. I worry that we're going to start to lose count. And again, if people are going to say, well, they can't go back to school, they're going to have to take account of some of these issues as well.
So some people have phrased this as the biggest problem is getting more money into the schools. Do you think that's true?
When I look at the statistics on where we've spent money in districts like the District of Columbia, which I'm going to give a number here. I may not be right about this, but I think I remember that it's one of the second highest funding pools in the country. And yet, if you look at results, it's at the bottom of the barrel. So I don't think you're going to find forget one for one between how much money you spend and what results you get. I'm all for spending more money in places that it might make a difference. I would spend more money on good teachers through merit pay for teachers who are really working hard. I would spend more money on principals and their training, because we know, and you know, Rick, that the quickest way to improve a school is to have a principal who has that fire in the belly and also the flexibility to do things that make sense for the school. I'm a major believer that one difference, we talked about the tertiary system earlier, the higher education system. The United States, for all of our problems in the higher ed system, we're the gold standard in higher ed. We have 2 things in higher ed that we don't have in K-12. One is variety. So you can go to a small liberal arts college, you can go to a big research university, you can go to a community college for a while. We have a lot of options. Secondly, we have competition. Wherever you are, you're competing for students. Even if you're Stanford, you're competing with Harvard and Yale and Princeton for the best students. So I think we need to have something in the K-12 system that, first of all, gives variety, and secondly, gives competition. And that's why I'm a major proponent of parental choice, a major proponent of charter schools, both public charter schools and private charter schools like the KIPP academies. I'm a major proponent of vouchers. Why do I believe in vouchers? Because maybe the best answer for your kid is a small, all-girls parochial school. By the way, I went to a high school that was all girls. And if parents could have better choices rather than just being wedded to their zip code, I think we would have better outcomes, particularly for underserved kids. I very often say these days, our K-12 system is really an opt-out system. If you are of means, you will move to a district where the schools are good. The houses will be expensive, but the schools will be good. You know, in Palo Alto or in Fairfax County, Virginia, or in Hoover, Alabama, where my family lives, the schools are good, but the houses are expensive. Now, if you're really wealthy, you'll send your kids to private schools. So who's stuck in failing neighborhood schools? Poor kids. And their parents don't therefore have the choices that these other parents have. And so when I'm angriest about this, Rick, I say, if you want to write an editorial in the Washington Post that says we shouldn't have school choice because it is robbing the public schools, send your kids to Anacostia to school and you can write that editorial. But don't send them to Sidwell Friends and write that editorial.
Secretary Rice, thank you so much for participating in this session. For the audience, you can see why we at the Hoover Institution are so pleased that Secretary Rice will become the director of the Hoover Institution on September 1. Thank you again, Condi.
Thank you so much, Rick. Great to be with you.